All right, gentlemen, once again, if you are using this correctly, you already have the review notes, U.S. History Regents OneNote. You have cut and paste out of the Part 2 here, Constitutional Foundations, into your own OneNote notebook that you create. You take these notes that I'm setting up here, and you add to them anything that you need while you are studying, reading the book, reading the Blue Review textbook, or listening to me that you need to make further notes on. Okay, let's pick up then with this part. So let's pull up just a bit here, and there we go. Constitutional Foundations, 1763 to 1824. You see that time period straddles from the French and Indian War through the American Revolution and into the early years of the Republic. So there's quite a big chunk here. Growing political and economic tensions led to the American colonists declaring their independence from Great Britain. Once independent, the new nation confronted the challenge of creating a stable federal republic. Well, let's pick up where we left off at the end of the first unit, the colonial foundations. Following the French and Indian War, the British government attempted to gain greater political and economic control over the colonies. Colonists resisted these efforts, leading to increased tensions between the colonists and the British government. Okay, so let's talk about this for a moment. Note, prior to the French and Indian War, the British had followed a policy of mercantilism, but also of salutary neglect. Both of those are good terms to know. Mercantilism, which comes from the same word as merchant, means that the colonies were required to sell the raw materials, iron ore, grain, tobacco, lumber, only to the mother country of the colony. They had no choice. Therefore, the mother country could set whatever low price they wanted to pay for them. On the other hand, colonies were required to buy all of their purchases, manufactured goods like furniture, but also sugar, molasses, rum, only from mother country or another of mother country's colonies. So mother country could set whatever high price they wanted the colony to pay. In other words, if you are the colony in Massachusetts, you had no choice but to sell your codfish and lumber to England. Couldn't sell to anybody else. Therefore, England could set whatever price they wanted. If you're in Massachusetts and you want to buy tea, sugar, rum, you could only buy it from mother country, England, or from one of England's colonies, which meant England set whatever price they wanted on it. So the colonists really were kind of screwed by mercantilism. This was enforced through tariffs. Tariffs, remember, are import taxes, or outright bans on importing. And smugglers were the people who tried to get around these. Okay, so that's mercantilism. On the other hand, we have this thing called salutary neglect. Salutary is just a fancy word for something that is good for your health. Neglect, of course, means doing nothing. So the policy of salutary neglect meant that as long as the colonies were making money, helping mother country prosper, mother country looked the other way a lot, let them more or less govern themselves, and didn't push the rules of mercantilism too hard. So as long as the business is making money, Britain wasn't going to cook the pot too hot. Well, along comes the French and Indian War. Britain and France get into a worldwide struggle called the 7 Years' War. It's about land in Europe, it's about economy in Europe, it's about borders in Europe, and about British and French colonies and to some degree Dutch colonies over in the Pacific Ocean, in the Caribbean. It was the whole world. The part of it that took place here in North America was called the French and Indian War, because the French made an alliance with some of the Indian tribes, and because the English were fighting French and Indians, they call it the French and Indian War. Well, France lost the war. And when France lost, they are given a choice. Give up all of North America. That means they own Canada and the Ohio River Valley and everything out to the Mississippi. France owned all that. They could give all of that to England, or they could give up the tiny island of Martinique in the Caribbean. It's an almost microscopic island. But the French made so much money from sugarcane out of Martinique, they were willing to give up all of North America to keep it. And that's how the British came to own all of North America. Okay. Well, I should say all of North America out to the Mississippi River. Let me be clear about that. The rest of it was Spanish. Well, now Britain is saddled with all the debt of having fought that war. Having borrowed huge amounts of money to fight it, how could they pay all of that back? They come up with a plan. They'll jack up the taxes and start really enforcing those salutary neglect rules. No more salutary neglect. Now we're really going to hammer the tariffs and the rules about trade. Okay, that's going to be a problem. There's a second problem. Britain has just finished an expensive war. The Indians are still around. They're still all living out in that Ohio River Valley. But the last thing Britain wants and can afford is to start up yet another war with the Indians. So they invent the Proclamation Line of 1763, a line across the top of the Appalachian Mountains. No colonists are allowed to settle in the newly acquired Ohio River Valley. So let's take a look at this for just a sec. Okay, so this is what North America looks like after the French and Indian War. You've got, and let me just fix this for just a second. You've got the British colonies down here, right? The dark red. You have all of this, which is the newly acquired from the French and Indian War. That's now British territory too. There's Spain on the other side of the Mississippi. This is Ohio. It's not a state yet. This is the Ohio River. The colonists would love to get in there. This is rich, rich farmland, and they desperately want to get in there and farm it. But it's got Indians living in it. So, if the colonists start to go in there, the British are afraid they're going to be back into a hugely expensive war. So they put this thing called the Proclamation Line of 1763 in here. This is the top of the Appalachian Mountains. They say to the colonists, you can't go past this. Let's take a look at this. Nope, wrong thing. There we go. This is another way to look at it. Here you have your New England colonies, your middle colonies, your southern colonies. And there you have that proclamation line and the Ohio River Valley. Well, the British then put this proclamation line in, stopped the colonists from going across, and they enforce it pretty harshly. A few colonists try to start some farms over there, and the British Army goes in and burns their farms down. So this gets the colonists pretty ticked off. Then the British go through a series of these attempts to tax the colonists. 1785, that's wrong. That should be 1765. Stupid me. So the war ends in 1763. 1765, they put in a thing called the Stamp Act. So these are the stamps. Every time you used a piece of paper, you had to buy a stamp like this. You would buy it, you would cut it out, and you would glue it to whatever the piece of paper was to prove that you had paid the tax. Now, it says 1 penny there. That may seem like nothing to you. It wasn't much. The Stamp Act tax was actually not that expensive, but it was more than a penny. A penny meant more in those days. The colonists hated this. They would print on their newspapers a spot. This is where you were supposed to put that stamp to remind you of how awful it was. So here is a newspaper from the day, the Pennsylvania Journal. And there is where you were supposed to put the stamp when you bought it. And it was this protest that they made. The new tax, I argue, I always tell classes, was a really dumb idea. Why? Every piece of paper used had to have a stamp stuck to it. You bought the stamp as a way of paying the tax. Before this, taxes were on imports, tariffs. The cost was folded into the price, but the customer didn't see the tax. The guy, the merchant, or the shipper, the warehouse guy, he saw the tax, he paid the tax. All you knew as a customer was, well, the price was a little more. But now, the customer is looking right at that tax, the stamp, every time they buy a piece of paper. It's right in their face. And paper? Let's think about that. What paper are we talking about? Well, newspapers, receipts by businesses, legal papers from lawyers, shipping documents from merchants. So who is stuck for the tax? People who read the political news in newspapers. Businessmen who are running the businesses in the colonies and are politically active. The lawyers who are running the legal system in the colonies. In fact, the political, economic, and intellectual power of the colonies are the ones Britain is most angering by this tax. And so the cry starts to go up. No taxation without representation. The colonists say, we, in the colonies, we have no elected representatives in Parliament. Massachusetts didn't get to elect a member of Parliament. Without that, no tax by Parliament is legal. The colonists want what is called actual representation. That is, I get to vote for a guy who I send to the Parliament to speak for me. That's what they meant by representation. But the British say, you are represented. Parliament speaks for all the people. The British are used to a thing called virtual representation. Most people in England can't vote because they don't own any land. You could only vote if you owned land. But even though they couldn't vote, they still think of Parliament as the body that speaks on behalf of the body of the English people. I don't have to actually vote for a guy for Parliament to be defending my rights. As a group, Parliament speaks for all of us as a group. So when the colonists say no taxation without representation, the British don't really understand what they mean because they're using the word differently. Well, the American colonists start to organize boycotts. That's when you refuse to buy, for instance, in this case, British goods. It's a word you should know. A Stamp Act Congress meets. For the first time, really, delegates from all the colonies unite in a cause. Non-importation agreements. This is when colonies all agree to go along with these boycotts. And there are even some violent protests. Some of the tax collectors wind up getting the living daylights beaten out of them. Some of them are even killed. Parliament finally backs off and repeals the Stamp Act. All right, so the colonists win. They win, but they lose. They repeal the Stamp Act, but they pass a thing called the Declaratory Act. Parliament declares that the Stamp Act was perfectly legal, and they could tax the colonies any time they want. In other words, well, we've decided not to tax you this way, but we could if we felt like it. In some ways, this is even worse and more of an insult than the Stamp Act itself. Okay, well now the colonists are good and ticked off. Then come the Townshend Acts. So we've gone from 1765, now we're 1767, and you see the dates, little by little closer to what's going to be the American Revolution. The Townshend Acts put new taxes on glass, lead, paint, tea. British government says, well, these are not necessary for you to live. They're not even necessary for you to do business. They're just sort of little luxury items. If you built a house in the colonies, it was nice to be able to paint it, not just leave it raw wood. It was nice to have glass to put in the windows, but most, poor houses just had wooden shutters. Well, they're luxury goods, but the middle class in the colonies bought a lot of this kind of stuff. They wanted to show off their wealth a little bit. And so these were pretty popular items. It was also done without that representation we just talked about. But here's the big problem of the Townshend Acts. How are you going to enforce these taxes? They'll be enforced by vice admiralty courts. If you are accused of violating the law, you don't go in front of a civilian judge and a jury of your peers, as required by Magna Carta. You go in front of, let me pull this out, you go in front of a military court made up of Navy officers. And you don't have the same rights in that court as you do in a regular civilian court. So the Townshend Act was really treating colonists not merely as criminals, but as enemy, aliens, traitors in war, a conquered people, not like fellow Englishmen. Well, as you can imagine, that really gets people ticked off. And it particularly gets people ticked off in Boston. Boston is a great port city of the day. There was a lot of trade in and out of it, and a lot of smuggling. So they're the ones who sort of have the biggest stake in this. 1770, you have this event called the Boston Massacre. People in Boston are increasingly angry, increasingly hate British officials who they see as being unfair to them. The British start sending more troops to Boston to kind of keep everybody in control. Those troops keep getting into scuffles, fights, and brawls with the locals, roughneck sailors, gangs of teenage apprentice craftsmen. Well, finally, one frosty cold night of March 5th, 1770, a group of these very rough characters, and that's what they were, probably a little bit drunk, we think, go down to the State House, which was the government hall, like City Hall in Boston. There's one lone soldier standing outside of it on duty, and they start giving him a hard time. They're yelling at him, screaming at him, pushing up against him. They start throwing snowballs, then they start putting rocks in the snowballs, and the crowd is getting angrier and angrier. Well, this poor guy is getting really kind of pushed up against it. He's pushed up against the gate. It's really a bad scene. An officer of the British Army and 7 other soldiers arrive to back him up. to try to get this, angry crowd a little bit more under control and a little bit more in line. The crowd gets rougher, more violent, and a gun goes off. Who fired? Nobody knows. Probably, nobody knows for sure, but it probably was one of the soldiers' guns went off by accident as they're getting shoved, or maybe he had his finger on the trigger, he gets pushed, and in a panic it goes off. But that's actually what happens. The other soldiers heard that shot. They assume that they're supposed to start firing. They lower their rifles and they shoot into the crowd. And I shouldn't say rifles, muskets. Remember, these are one-shot black powder muskets. So it's not like they're machine gunning the crowd. They got one shot there. So they take their muskets, they hear the shot go off, and then all of them pop off as well. Their commander, the officer, is standing there yelling at them not to fire. 3 people get killed. A few more are wounded. 2 of them will die later of wounds. So there are 5 people who are killed altogether. The crowd disperses. But, wow, was this a big deal. News of this is spread from one end of the colonies to the other. It starts to be called a massacre, not merely, an incident or something like this. And the soldiers wind up being put on trial. 2 of them are actually found guilty of manslaughter. Manslaughter is not murder. Murder is an intentional killing. Manslaughter is when you do something not intending to kill anybody, but you wind up causing somebody's death. The lawyer who defended the soldiers was John Adams, the revolutionary. He thought the crowd was completely out of line, completely lawless, and he did not want the cause of Americans fighting for their just rights as Englishmen to be tied up with a bunch of rowdy characters trying to beat up a soldier. But it became a major propaganda point for the anti-British cause. Now, let me show you. Okay, so this is an illustration from the time of the Boston Massacre. This is an engraving. So all the lines you see here were carved into a copper plate that you then spread ink over the plate, wipe the ink off, and the ink would stay in the grooves in the plate. If you pressed a piece of paper on top of it, you got the image. And then this particular copy of it is hand tinted. So they couldn't actually print effectively color. Somebody had to sit there with a little paintbrush and color in all the colors. You notice engraved, printed, and sold by Paul Revere. I'll just point this out. Hang on. There it is. Paul Revere. Paul Revere, by trade, was a silversmith, so he was used to dealing with metal and engraving on metal, and he printed a lot of stuff on the side. He will later be the famous guy of Paul Revere's Ride. He was already a big activist against the British in Boston. And he makes this woodcut as part of his effort to show what brutes the British are. Now, we take a look at this for a minute as a kind of document. So that's the context of it. What does it represent? It represents a turning point, if you like, of anti-British sentiment. People who might have said, well, I may not like everything the British do, but the law is the law, are now looking at the British as butcherers and murderers of the colonists. So this is a kind of turning point in people's sentiments in the war. Yeah. Also, you want to think about, with a document, reliability. Who's the audience for this? Well, it's a publicly published thing, so it's meant for the public. He published it in the colonies, and it was meant to be seen by colonists. I don't think he would have minded it being seen back in England, because I think he would have thought that some Englishmen might be sympathetic to the poor colonists mistreated this way. But the principal audience was fellow colonists, and the purpose of it, so we think audience, purpose, the purpose is to stir up anger over this event. The soldiers are not being shown as poor sympathetic guys who were just trying to defend themselves. They're shown as sort of vicious guys out to kill colonists. So that's the purpose, is propaganda. And the point of view, Revere was not there that night. As far as we know, he never saw this happen. So he got other people to tell him what was going on. So he's getting secondhand accounts, and he's getting it from fellow colonists. He didn't go interview the British soldiers. And the bias here is he already is angry about what the British are doing in Boston. So he brings that to bear here. I'll just point out a few interesting things about this. First of all, let me pull this down here a bit. We notice, maybe I should pull this in, the people over here who are getting hit. Yeah? If I can do this, move this over just a bit. So they all look like well-dressed, respectable, sort of middle-aged gentlemen. There's a woman there, right? Okay, no. The people that were there that night were a rough and rowdy lot. They were sailors off the docks, and they were young teenagers with a chip on their shoulder. One interesting thing they do include, though, is this. That's a black guy. Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was a sailor. You'll read a lot of legends about him. We actually don't know a great deal about him, but we know more than you might think. We think he was part Native American. He may have been part Native American and part black. We think he was a Spanish-speaking guy, and he was a sailor on the ships. So he's actually depicted there. So are the rest of these characters here, although he's shown as somewhat more, if you like, respectable than he would have. He probably wouldn't have been this well-dressed or anything. And here they're standing here all innocently being massacred, right? Well, no. We know that they were actually in the process of beating up the soldiers. Now let's take a look at the soldiers for a minute. Here you see the officer giving them commands as they line up in a row, British style, and fire a volley into the colonists. We also know for sure that was not the case. They were backed up against the State House. The officer was yelling at them not to fire, and in a panic, they just popped off randomly, if you will, anyway. So that's an interesting change. I'll also point something else out that a lot of people miss. Let me show you this. This is my favorite thing about this piece. First conspiracy theory in American history. There are the soldiers, right? There they are. They got their weapons. Lift this up just a bit. Butcher's Hall was a real place. It was a butcher shop, or really a butcher meeting place, behind the square. What's this? There's some sniper in the window up here. According to Paul Revere, there was some guy up in the window popping off and killing colonists from his spot up here. There is absolutely no truth to that. Nobody has ever found any evidence of any such thing. But that doesn't stop Paul Revere. Okay. The Boston Massacre becomes a big emotional moment in this march toward what's going to be the American Revolution, although they don't know it yet. Always remember, history hasn't happened yet, so they don't know what's coming. Okay, after the Boston Massacre, that's 1770. 1773, you get, famously, the Tea Act. The British think they're going to cut the colonies a kind of break. So they require a monopoly on the tea trade to the British-owned British East India Company. Okay. But they also, the British government, subsidizes the British East India Company. It keeps the price of tea down. In other words, the tea from the British East India Company was actually cheaper than the tea the colonists were paying to smuggle in to get around the British government. But the colonists again had no voice in the creation of this monopoly, and even though it was going to save them money, they saw it as shutting down their right to buy tea from the Dutch if they felt like it. And so you got the Boston Tea Party protest. The colonists dumped the tea in Boston Harbor. This is a depiction from some time later of the event. It's probably not all that far off in certain ways. The Tea Party ship was a bit smaller than it seems to be here. But one thing you might notice is Indians, right? Well, no, they're colonists, but they dressed up as Indians to do this. Why? Two reasons. One is it was a kind of disguise. It wasn't really. Everybody on the dock knew who these guys were. But the other was, American Indians, even though the colonists treated them so badly, were sort of seen as free men. They weren't under the control of the British or any other government. And so in the imagination, faulty, but the imagination of the colonists, Indians represented a kind of freedom, the natural man without government. And so it was kind of part of their protest move there. Well, the Tea Party is a big, again, propaganda thing, but it really infuriates the British because now the colonists are destroying valuable property of their businesses. So the British government, furious about this, in 1774 passes the Intolerable Acts, also called the Coercive Acts. It shuts down Boston Harbor completely. You want to destroy tea? We're going to shut down your whole business. The Quartering Act requires colonists to house and feed British soldiers in their own private homes. It takes apart the Massachusetts local colonial government. And part of the Coercive Acts is the Quebec Act, which at first seems to have nothing to do with the colonies, but you got to look at it. Quebec was the area right next door that had been French Canada. The British have a separate problem there. They have to start organizing a government in this new province of Quebec. As far as the British were concerned, it had nothing to do with what was going on in Massachusetts. So they decide, well, Quebec is full of French, leftover, French-speaking Catholic colonists. So tell you what, we'll give these French-speaking Catholic colonists, they can have their own little colonial assembly so they can get some government going. We don't want to fight a war over religion there, so we'll let the Catholics have freedom of religion. And that's great. The colonists, particularly in Massachusetts, went nuts over this. Quebec is being given self-government, and they're taking it away from Massachusetts. On top of it, they're giving freedom of religion to Catholics? If you were from Massachusetts and an old Puritan, you looked at Catholics like we might look at a Taliban terrorist. No kidding. So to them, the British government was handing over to these weird Catholic terrorists self-government, and good English Protestants in Massachusetts were having government taken away from them. Men like Samuel Adams, John Adams, Paul Revere, John Hancock, etc., after the Coercive Acts, begin to organize resistance. They start to organize the men of the Massachusetts militia, who will one day be called Minutemen, because they're ready in a minute to go out and help fight for America. Revolutionaries, etc. They start stockpiling weapons and ammunition, particularly out in a town in Massachusetts called Concord. In April of 1775, now we have marched from 1763 to 1775, notice, April of 75, the British Army in Boston gets word that there is a stockpile of ammunition and weapons out in Concord, which is, today it's, I guess, about a half-hour drive outside of Boston. They decide they're going to go take the weapons and the ammunition and see if they can't arrest Samuel Adams and some of these other characters. They march out of Boston marching toward Concord, but before they get there, they get to this little town called Lexington and encounter, of course, the Massachusetts militia, a bunch of farmers with muskets. Again, just like we saw with the Boston Massacre. Who fired? To this day, nobody knows. A gun went off, and when that happened, both sides started firing at each other, and the American Revolution was underway. They fight the Battle of Lexington, and then a little later in the day, the Battle of Concord. The British are shocked that they're getting shot at. The Americans are shocked that they're winning, and the British retreat to Boston, and now we've got the American Revolution underway. Okay, we are not going to go through the whole American Revolution, the battles, the strategy, the tactics. What the Board of Regents seems to be focusing on next. They tried to mitigate the conflict. To mitigate means to lessen, to mix up, to dilute the conflict between the British and the colonists. In 1775, remember, nobody is using the word independence. As far as the folks in Massachusetts are concerned, they are fighting for their rights as fellow Englishmen. That's what they're about. The Continental Congress starts to meet in Philadelphia because all of the colonies, seeing what's going on in Massachusetts, know this is an emergency that involves us all. The Congress wants to keep everybody on the same page. So instead of picking a guy from Massachusetts, they pick a guy from the southern colonies to keep them on board, from Virginia. One of the most respected men in Virginia. He had had experience during the French and Indian War as a military commander. And they put him in charge of this new Continental Army. That, of course, is George Washington. They send the king, George III, a thing called the Olive Branch Petition. This is a letter to the king, reaching out an olive branch, the traditional symbol of peace, asking, look, we are your faithful sons of England over here. Let's work something out. The king, instead of reaching back, declares the colonies out of the king's peace, which is a legal term. It means they are no longer protected by the king. The king's justice no longer runs, and they have become foreign enemies. He's kicking them out, if you like, and saying, we are going to send over the army to crush you. In January of 1776, okay, now we are in January of 76, months before July, notice, Thomas Paine publishes a pamphlet, Common Sense. which is the first time you really get people saying the word independence. Paine argues that just as children grow up and grow away from parents, we here have become a new thing, a new people. We are no longer Englishmen in the colonies. We are now Americans, a new kind of people. And so he says we require a new country, and therefore we need to be independent. This runs like wildfire through the 13 colonies. Everybody reads common sense, and it starts to have a real effect. In June of 1776, Congress starts talking about a thing called the Lee Resolution. Richard Henry Lee from Virginia proposes that, quote, these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent. The Congress says we can't just do this without explaining why we're doing it. So they create a committee. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin. It also included Roger Sherman and included Robert Livingston from New York. But Sherman and Livingston really don't get involved. The committee is really Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin to write a Declaration of Independence. Jefferson writes it. Adams and Franklin then sit down with him and help him. They edit it, they make some changes, and then it goes back to the Continental Congress, who does some serious rewriting on it, as we'll see in a minute, before the Continental Congress itself finally passes it on July 4th, 1776. Many, many wonderful things in that declaration, key things to note. The purpose of the Declaration is to make a legal case that the king has lost his right to rule the colonies. They were loyal British subjects, these guys in the Continental Congress, before this, but they say because the king keeps violating his own laws, keeps denying the colonists their rights as English citizens, he has given up his right to be king of the colonies, and therefore we have a legal right to claim independence. The key sentence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Okay. Few key points, and there's only so much I can do in these reviews. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Notice, the truths we're talking about are objectively true. If I told you there's a stone lion outside of Farrell, there either is or there is not. If we all vote in favor of there being one, it doesn't change whether or not that stone lion is actually sitting out there. We can argue about it, we can discuss it, we can go out and look and see, but whether we like it or not, it is there. That is what Jefferson is saying, and it's very important to understand that about these rights. That's the idea of natural law. The truths he's talking about are not because we all agree on them, or we wish they were true, or the government has passed a law saying, here is what we think. They're true whether anybody likes it or not, whether a government recognizes it or not, whether your neighbor seems to know it or not. One of the truths, all men are created equal. Notice, created equal. We are not equal because I recognize you as equal, you recognize me as equal, therefore we're equal. We are not equal because the government passes a law making us equal. Jefferson is saying, built into our humanity by nature itself, put there by God is an equality. Governments are moral to the extent that they recognize that. So we're created equal, and that equality is endowed by the Creator, not by each other. They're endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. The word unalienable means cannot be given away or taken away or lost. To alienate something in law means to lose ownership of it. So if you sell a piece of land, right, you sell your house, legally what you're doing is alienating the property. You no longer own it, you are giving ownership to someone else. Jefferson is saying the rights he's talking about cannot be taken away, given up, lost. They are always yours, whether the rest of the world acknowledges it or not. Among these unalienable rights are life, liberty, and the right to pursue happiness. Today we'd call these human rights. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. The purpose of government, says Jefferson, is to protect people from these rights being taken away. I should put this. Being taken away by force or by law. If somebody tries to take your rights away, government is there to step in to stop it. And to maximize, this is how I put it, to your freedom to swing your arm without interfering with my right not to be punched in the nose. I've mentioned before, that's the old phrase attributed to Franklin, Locke, and a lot of other people. Nobody, I think, really knows who said it. I have a right to swing my fist, but my right to swing my fist ends at the tip of your nose. So how do we create rules that protect your nose, but also protect my right to swing my fist? We have to figure that out. That's the point of having a government. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. If we're all equal, and all equally have these rights, then a government over us can only have power if we all make an agreement to give it power to protect all of us and each of us. If we do not consent to that government as a people, it loses its power. Therefore, when a government isn't doing its job, it is the right of the governed to change it or abolish it. Here's a couple of little asides. They won't ask on the regions. Declaration was published in the newspapers, and on July 9th, George Washington had it read out to the people of Manhattan and to his own troops at Bowling Green. If you go up from the Staten Island ferry, Bowling Green is right up there. It's the first subway stop you come to, just about a block and a half up. On exactly the same day, General Sir William Howe, Commander-in-Chief of all British troops in North America, was sitting in the Rose and Crown, which was at the top of New Dorp Lane. I really should call it a boarding house. New Dorp Lane and Richmond Road. So just a few blocks from Farrell, that's where the British government found out about the Declaration of Independence. On September 11th, 1776, so the Declaration is July 4th, the British and the Americans then fight here in New York the Battle of Long Island in what is today Brooklyn and Brooklyn Heights and then over to Manhattan. The British are winning at that point, but Admiral Richard Lord Howe, who was General Howe's brother, reached out to the Continental Congress and said, look, let's meet, let's talk about this. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Edward Rutledge from the Continental Congress tried to hash out peace one last time. Howe met with them and told them he could offer anything they wanted, except recognizing independence. Franklin said they could negotiate anything with Howe, except independence. The peace conference, as it was called, on September 11th, failed. But it was a success in that it was the first time that the new government of the new United States came face to face with the British government, literally, and offered a chance to take it all back, said no. And that was at the Conference House on the southern tip of Staten Island. Okay. Let's talk about African Americans for a moment during the American Revolution. Jefferson included a paragraph in the Declaration accusing the king of unjustly creating slavery and imposing slavery on the colonists. What's he saying? That the king had unjustly kidnapped Africans, quote, a people who had never offended him, transported them to America, and had stopped all attempts by the colonies to end the slave trade. And that's one of the things Jefferson said. Well, that's what makes the king so rotten. Well, let's be clear. That paragraph that Jefferson wrote was taken out of the final version of the Declaration. First, the only state that had seriously tried to stop slavery was Pennsylvania. Second, a lot of New England shippers were involved in the slave trade. And third, the whole southern plantation economy, and most of the southern delegates to the Continental Congress were big plantation owners, depended on slavery. They were not about to let an anti-slavery thing into the Declaration. On the other hand, Lord Dunmore, British governor for the British Army, had promised that any slave who escaped his American master and joined the British Army to fight the Americans would be given his freedom. So African Americans ran away from their slave masters and joined the British Army thinking they were going to get some freedom. Well, sadly, the Americans lost that chance to live up to the rest of the Declaration by ending slavery. We could have ended slavery in 1776. We chose not to. And very, very sadly, after the war, the British agreed to return all American property. Those slaves who had fought for the British Army, they don't get their freedom. They get sent back to their slave masters. Let's talk about women for a minute. The same time that Adams is writing the Declaration of Independence with Jefferson in the Continental Congress, his wife, Abigail, who was a very bright woman and advised John on a lot of topics, sent him a very famous letter. Know it, they loved to ask about it, urging that he and his friends should, quote, remember the women, unquote, in their new American Republic. It is known as the Remember the Women letter. Know it. She says it was the women who had suffered seeing husbands and sons die in war through the centuries. It was the women who always wanted the peace. It was women who kept the farms going as the men fought, and women, she said, who should have a voice in the new government. Well, doesn't happen. Women remained in their traditional gender roles. They did become important, though, with the idea of Republican motherhood. This is small r Republican, not the political party. This idea was that the new republic would only work if its next generation was brought up with good morals, a generous spirit for fellow citizens, a good education to make wise choices, and a spirit of self-sacrifice to put the country ahead of their own personal interests. So we would only have a really strong republic if our kids learned how to do a republic well. Mothers were the most influential force in their children's lives. So good mothers, committed to good democratic ideals, would make good citizens of their children, and that was considered very important. Finally, let's mention Native Americans briefly. Native Americans, to some degree, actually took the British side. They had dealt with American colonists, and American colonists had spent most of their time pushing Native Americans around. They were afraid that if the Americans won, there would be no restraint on them at all, and the Americans would just trample the Native Americans in their own lands. So when the United States achieved independence, a lot of that actually came true. Americans began to flood into what had been Indian territory, and Native Americans made peace treaties with the new country, but they did not benefit really from this new independent United States. Okay, I'm going to leave this here, and I'm going to pick up with in the next lecture, part 2 of this constitutional foundations, because we have to go into some detail about the new government.